Klimawandel, Energieversorgung, CO2-Emissionen, Automobilindustrie, schreckliche Verwüstungen durch ein Hochwasser, Transfer der Technologie, die Kernenergie, Diesel- und Abgasproblematik, klimaneutral zu sein.
She's been talking about it most of her political career. German Chancellor Angela Merkel is no stranger to the science of climate change. But this summer, climate change became a reality in Germany itself. Flash flooding killed more than 200 people and caused billions of euros worth of damage. As Merkel visited the devastation, she linked the floods to global warming and admitted Germany would have to become far more ambitious on climate policy.
Wir werden uns dieser Naturgewalt entgegenstemmen, kurzfristig, aber eben auch mittel- und langfristig durch eine Politik, die eben die Natur und das Klima mehr in den Betracht zieht, als wir das in den letzten Jahren gemacht haben. Auch das wird notwendig sein.
Angela Merkel has been in power for 16 years, and there she was in her final months in office at the scene of the disaster, urging swifter action. It sounded like an impassioned plea, but what does that message say about her responsibility for climate policy over the past 2 decades, and Germany's responsibility as a leading industrialized nation?
Angela Merkel hat, glaube ich, besser als die meisten anderen Politiker verstanden, worum es geht bei der Klimaproblematik.
She has an incredibly mixed record on climate change, on climate policy. And if you just look at the end numbers, if you just look at the CO2 that Germany is emitting, then I think that should be the dominant narrative.
The reality is we've seen Merkel take very different approaches to climate policy. Let's have a look at the various faces we've seen. 3 chancellors, 3 paths, 3 sets of results.
The diplomatic leader who persuaded her global counterparts to promise climate action. The chancellor beholden to her country's powerful car companies and business interests. And a crisis manager trying to catch up on protecting the climate as the clock ticks down on her time in office. This was Angela Merkel's first major climate moment as Chancellor. She took her environment minister to the ice sheets in Greenland, on the front lines of global warming.
Dass ich das hier noch einmal so sehen konnte, mit welcher Dringlichkeit hier die Dinge ablaufen, das wird mir auch durchaus noch mal Kraft geben, zusammen mit dem Umweltminister ganz engagiert dafür zu kämpfen, dass wir handeln.
This message wasn't new from Merkel. Back in the 90s, she served as environment minister. As a scientist, it was a role she relished, and one that helped put her on the political map. In 1995, Merkel hosted the first UN climate conference in Berlin, getting fellow environment ministers from around the world to work together. She carried that climate momentum into her first term as Chancellor. She used the G8 meeting in Germany for 2 important steps: getting industrialized nations to commit to cutting global CO2 emissions in half by 2050, and to agree that climate change is man-made.
These were significant achievements, progress on a global level, and this is when German media started calling Angela Merkel the climate chancellor.
On the international stage, I think it is fair to say, particularly in the rich world, that Merkel was a climate chancellor. She brought something new to these discussions, and she helped convince some of the rising figures like George W. Bush.
Merkel was keen to focus on climate at home in Germany too. She ditched a previous government's plans to close nuclear power plants and decided to keep them running. Nuclear energy is low carbon, so it would help the country reach its emissions targets. But in 2011, a catastrophe on the other side of the world changed her mind. In Japan, a tsunami hit the Fukushima nuclear power plant and caused a meltdown. In Germany, Merkel made a remarkable policy turnaround.
Wir werden schrittweise bis Ende 2022 vollständig auf die Kernenergie verzichten.
This was a big transition. Merkel went from keeping nuclear power plants open in order to cut carbon emissions to shutting them down because of Fukushima. And on top of that, she launched a new plan.
The Energiewende, or energy transition. This was a roadmap to supply the entire country with 100% renewable energy. And this was the Chancellor reacting to events at a moment of opportunity to reach a political goal.
In Merkels politischem Ansatz lassen sich Überzeugung und Kalkül auch nicht immer vollkommen klar trennen. Ich glaube, die Klimapolitik ist ein gutes Beispiel dafür, für ein Thema, von dessen Bedeutung sie einerseits überzeugt ist und wo man aber auch sehr gut sehen kann, dass sie eben sozusagen dieser Überzeugung nur dann nachgibt oder zum Durchbruch verhilft, wenn sie da auch ein Fenster der politischen Möglichkeiten sieht.
Merkel's government introduced a scheme to pay anyone, individuals or companies, for producing renewable energy and feeding it into the electricity grid. That helped create a boom in solar power. It became one of the cheapest energy sources worldwide. But there were global setbacks. At the Copenhagen summit in 2009, Merkel and world leaders pushed for an agreement on stricter emissions targets and failed. One of a row of disappointments for developing nations looking to wealthy nations like Germany to lead.
Germany is one of those countries in the global north that emit the biggest. They are one of those countries that are responsible for the biggest emission. And we also are expecting the fact that there should be leadership that comes out from that area, because developing countries, they can provide the tools that we need for us to see that we attain the climate justice that we need.
And then a different crisis took over the spotlight. You might remember the crippling Eurozone debt crisis. Leaders made saving economies their top priority. And it became clear how powerful the forces driving the German economy really were.
Mercedes, Volkswagen, BMW, global names, industry giants crucial to the German economy. Cars give Germany a robust domestic manufacturing base and a mighty export balance sheet. German car companies and suppliers employed more than 800,000 people in 2019 and posted earnings of 436 billion euros. They are also some of the biggest political cross-party donors in the country. Merkel, like all chancellors before her, had to take their needs into consideration.
Europa, das im Augenblick nun wirklich nach Quellen des Wachstums sucht, darf sich nicht seine eigenen Quellen des Wachstums sozusagen selbst kappen. Und zu Wachstum und Innovation gehört Automobilindustrie aller Klassen von Fahrzeugen.
Germany has a complete blind spot when it comes to its cars. It's got a reputation for being very progressive when it comes to climate policy, but when you look at kind of one of the cornerstones of its economy, building cars that burn fossil fuels, then you see that a lot of it is really just spin. And I mean, they've done it well, but essentially Germany has been very reluctant to stand up to the car lobby.
In 2013, the auto industry's lobbying group wrote a pointed letter that started with the informal greeting, Liebe Angela, Dear Angela. They insisted the Chancellor could not let car makers be regulated to death. They were worried about an EU proposal to regulate emission standards for cars. Merkel slammed the brakes on the proposal. You remember that German media had celebrated Merkel as the climate chancellor? Now, many of them slammed her for allowing car makers to wield power, money, and influence. But their needs and their contribution to the German economy cannot simply be dismissed, something Merkel's former environment minister acknowledges.
Die Politik muss eben den Klimaschutz gleichwohl in Einklang bringen mit, ich sag mal, der Bewahrung des Wohlstandes in der Bundesrepublik Deutschland und mit der Tatsache, dass Automobilproduktion in der Umstellung eine gewisse Zeit braucht und nicht von heute auf morgen geht. Das ist einfach so.
The biggest trade union in Germany says many auto workers support efforts to decarbonize the economy, but the changes that will require are triggering deep uncertainty.
Über 200.000 Beschäftigte sind hier in Deutschland damit beschäftigt, den klassischen Verbrennungsmotor herzustellen. Das ist absehbar in relativ kurzer Zeit, dass es keine neuen Fahrzeuge mehr gibt mit Verbrennungsmotoren. 2035, 36 wird das auskommen. Das heißt aber für viele, was habe ich dann für eine Perspektive?
It's clearly a juggling act, one that got more difficult when the Volkswagen emissions scandal broke. Europe's biggest car maker was rigging diesel engines to dupe emissions tests.
This was a clear case of cheating their customers, the governments, the rest of the world in effect, because this is about their emissions, and kind of pretending that their vehicles were cleaner than they actually were.
That cheating had an impact. The diesel emission scandal appeared to damage Merkel's faith in the auto industry.
Das hat sie, glaube ich, sehr ernüchtert, hat vielleicht auch dazu geführt, dass sie seitdem ein bisschen weniger Rücksichten nimmt auf die Wünsche der Automobilkonzerne. Aber ja, sie kann eben, sagen wir mal so, ganz fallen lassen, kann sie die nicht, weil sie eben die wirtschaftlichen Auswirkungen dann befürchten muss.
Balancing the power of the car industry and the pressure to clean up its emissions put her in a difficult position. So did another big polluter, coal.
Germany stopped mining hard coal in 2018, but operations like this, digging up lignite or brown coal, are not due to close until 2038. Germany is the world's biggest producer of brown coal, and it's one of the dirtiest fuels in the world. Remember that Merkel phased out nuclear energy? That left a gap until renewables catch up, and Germany has turned to fossil fuels like coal in the meantime. Brown coal is important in the former East Germany, where big lignite mines provide thousands of jobs. But Fridays for Future activists say the bigger picture is simply far more important.
We have some of the largest sources of CO2 within Germany. That is our coal mines. We are building more roads, even though this entire country is covered with roads. We are expanding the car industries. There is still complete villages being destroyed in favor of the coal industries. So it's madness, honestly, what is happening in this country.
At home, Angela Merkel, the industry chancellor, was battling to protect jobs and Germany's economic success. But on the international circuit, she maintained her image as a visionary climate chancellor.
She played a key role in negotiating the 2015 Paris Accord, when industrialized nations committed to keep global warming well below 2 degrees Celsius. Still, the increasing urgency of global warming would force her into catch-up mode. – 2017 saw extreme weather and climate events come thick and fast, devastating hurricanes in North America, alarming heat waves in Europe, record wildfires even in icy Greenland, global sea levels reaching new highs. And then one of the world's biggest emitters, the US, left the Paris Climate Accord. It was a blow to Angela Merkel and her counterparts. They did manage to seal a recommitment to the Paris Climate Agreement targets. That was seen as a major success. But at home, there was a setback.
Wir haben uns für das Jahr 2020 vorgenommen, unsere CO2-Emissionen um 40% zu reduzieren. Und wir müssen mit großer Wahrscheinlichkeit sagen, dass wir dieses Ziel, was wir uns 2007 vorgenommen haben, leider nicht erfüllen werden.
It was a failure of wealthy nations felt by climate change campaigners around the world.
So it is a two-way thing that as we adapt in Africa to the climate change crisis, the global north, of which Germany is one of it, is able to mitigate the impact. Like we shouldn't play politics with climate change because it's going to consume us.
With pressure growing, Merkel's cabinet announced Germany's first national climate law in 2019. It included measures to get households and companies to reduce emissions using a carbon pricing system. The climate law did set targets for different economic sectors like transport and industry. But environmentalists and activists insisted that even with the law, the burden on future generations to cut emissions was too heavy.
Their criticism isn't surprising. If you look at the bottom line, Germany hasn't reduced its overall emissions enough since Merkel took power. In fact, emissions from the transport sector, including the auto industry, have hardly changed at all. People demanding significant change decided politicians were not helping.
Young climate activists took their arguments from the streets to the Constitutional Court and won. The judges ruled that the burden on future generations was too high and the climate law partly unconstitutional. The Chancellor and her cabinet had to react. They hastily accelerated their plans, pushing forward the deadline to reach net zero emissions by 5 years.
It was a significant moment showing the Chancellor trying to play catch-up in her final months in office. Critics say she's trying to polish her climate image, but also responding to increased public awareness of climate change, especially as the effects are hitting home.
Climate change marked the start and end of her time as Chancellor. So what will her lasting impact be? Putting climate change on the agenda in her early years? Playing to the car industry and powerful economic forces for too long? Or her last flurry of action to put Germany on the path towards net zero?
Das Verdienst von Angela Merkel ist sicherlich, dass sie die Klimapolitik als Thema auf die internationale Bühne gehoben hat, übrigens schon sehr früh, schon 1995 als Umweltministerin. Das Versäumnis von ihr auf der anderen Seite ist, denke ich, dass sie eben im Inland in Deutschland selbst sich über lange Zeiträume nicht getraut hat, die nötigen Konsequenzen dann auch durchzusetzen.
Das Erbe der Kanzlerin der Klimapolitik wird sein, dass tatsächlich die Vorarbeiten, die wir auch als Deutschland und in Europa mit der Europäischen Union geleistet haben, dass die tragfähig sind, dass die Vereinigten Staaten sind wieder zurückgekommen ins Klimaschutzabkommen. Es ist bisher kein Land ausgetreten, also kein anderes Land.
She has an incredibly mixed record on climate change, on climate policy. And if you just look at the end numbers, if you just look at the CO2 that Germany is emitting, then I think that should be the dominant narrative.
Everyone will be impacted by the climate change crisis, either rich or poor. So that is why we need to act now. I need to start seeing Germany leading also as one of those developed countries, in walking the talk.
What does Merkel herself have to say? What is her scientific analysis of how she's done? Well, at her final formal press conference, she offered this assessment.
Ich bin der Meinung, dass ich sehr viel Kraft für den Klimaschutz aufgewandt habe und immer auch gerade in der Zeit, in der ich Parteivorsitzende war, in der CDU, sehr dafür geworben habe, den Klimaschutz nicht aus dem Auge zu verlieren und ihn beständig voranzutreiben. Und trotzdem bin ich ja mit wissenschaftlichem Verstand ausreichend ausgerüstet, um zu sehen, dass die objektiven Gegebenheiten erfordern, dass man in dem Tempo nicht weitermachen kann, sondern schneller werden muss.
And the crisis is growing. The UN now says global warming will reach that critical 1.5-degree threshold far earlier than previously expected. The climate will affect everything, and the new chancellor will have to build that into everything she or he does.